Welcome to Speculative Sandbox, your audio playground for creative storytellers. My name is Vicky Lawn, and each episode, I and a guest will unpack a fiction trope with an eye for character development and narrative structures. Make sure to look for Speculative Sandbox on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, where you can join the conversation. Leave comments or questions, or let us know what other tropes we should cover. When the real world just doesn't cut it, let's get lost in a fictional one. Ever get stuck in a rut? You're waiting for ideas to flow, but the dam is up and the river is dry. Life gets in the way. Or maybe you're just tired and you need a little inspiration to get your creative juices going. I got the idea for this podcast from a colleague. Do you ever have that magical moment when you realize the person you work with is just as insane as you are? Insane in the best possible way, of course, where you can talk about all the things, like the way space can kill us in a split second without any warning. I told my colleague about my struggles with writer's block, and he said to me, "You need a digital sandbox where you can play around with other people who are creative and just get inspiration." Well, welcome to Speculative Sandbox. My name is Vicky Lawn, and I'm an author represented by Talcott Notch Literary. I write contemporary science fiction through the lens of a mixed-race Vietnamese-American woman. My book on submission is about an estranged mother and daughter who must reconcile if they hope to survive an alien invasion together. Half memoir, half science fiction, and 100% deranged fun. Meanwhile, I do write full-time in the government communications field, and I am obsessed with science fiction shows like Westworld and Black Mirror. But enough about me, let's talk about speculative fiction. Of course, what is a definition without some discourse? I didn't have to dive deep to discover that many people have different opinions about what classifies as speculative fiction. For the purpose of this episode, I decided to start at the top. According to the great internet deity Wikipedia, speculative fiction is a broad category of fiction encompassing elements that do not exist in reality, recorded history, nature, or the present universe. It covers themes in the context of supernatural, futuristic, and other imaginative realms. This, of course, includes science fiction and fantasy and all their subgenres. Ultimately, these hypothetical stories serve to entertain, educate, challenge, or warn its readers. While speculative fiction has a long history, basically since the beginning of oral storytelling, the term became popularized for showing distrust in traditional establishments starting in the 60s. There is some debate about whether or not speculative fiction should include fantastical elements, with the idea that stories should explore what could actually happen in real life. But for the purpose of this podcast, I think it's to say that we are no holds barred. This is a safe space for creative thinking, and I want to hear it all. Here's another interesting fact. According to statistics published by Tor in 2015, men outnumber women about 2-to-1 among English-language speculative fiction writers aiming for professional publication. The percentage does vary depending on genre, however, with women leading in the fields of urban fantasy, paranormal romance, and young adult fiction. I can speak to that one myself. When I was querying my manuscript, I was told by multiple sources that diverse female voices were badly needed in the science fiction genre. So here I am, I guess, doing my part. My hope is I can get many diverse voices showcased on this podcast and to continue diversifying my reading list. Now let's talk about story recommendations. This is going to be kind of a long list, but I want to get you guys started on what are some great titles to read. First, a disclaimer, I don't pretend to know everything in the whole wide world when it comes to books and theories and stories. I'm here to have a good time. I hope you are too. You may be very knowledgeable in the speculative fiction genres, or you may just be starting out. Either way, I hope this podcast has a place for you. If you've never read speculative fiction, there's no better time than the present. Here are some of my favorites that I've read. We're going to start out with The Body Scout by Lincoln Michel. Now, I'm sorry if I mispronounced names. I wasn't sure if it was Mitchell or Michelle. But The Body Scout explores a future where GMO companies and bionic modifications have dominated the economy, and it is reflected best in their acquisitions of baseball teams. So what is a way to show the condition of the United States? Look at its favorite pastime. The Monsanto Mets is the new leading baseball team, and We have essentially a corporate war or civil war between people who are for genetically modified organizations and people who pursue bionic modifications. And it's really interesting to see the society that Lincoln's created when people have access to either. Highly recommend. Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. We have, of course, this is one of the biggest dystopian stories that have hit pop culture in like the last decade or so, where we have the future United States has become Pan-Am, a society divided into sectors where they use gamified violence to enforce submission and servitude from the general populace. All Are Wrong Todays by Elan Mastey explores an alternate future where the scientific optimism of the mid-century is realized. Do you guys remember the Jetsons? How everything has that beautiful retro look to it and everything about the future is optimistic? This book starts you out in an alternate world, an alternate timeline where we actually achieved that. And today is that Jetsons experience. And when one man messes everything up, he accidentally resets the clock and puts us into the future that we're currently experiencing here. Fascinating stuff. One of my favorite aspects of this book, though, is how the author explores a new clean energy source where an engine gets its power from the turn of the earth. And I'm like, why aren't we doing that now? What do we need to do that now? You know, like the earth is always moving. Okay, then we have Time Traveler's Wife by Audrey Neffenegger, and of course this one's older. Came out when I was in college, 15 years ago, I'm kind of guessing. But this one is about a man with a genetic disorder, which causes him to blink in and out of time uncontrollably, and his attempts to have a normal life with romances, family, all that stuff. This book changed my life when it came out. It's terribly romantic, but it also has a lot of reflection on what we take for granted in life. So I think it's a great read. Followed up with a very fun read called Futuristic Violence in Fancy Suits. This one is by Jason Pargin, one of my favorite authors. This book depicts a future where everyone has logged into a social media network called The Blink that live streams everything you're doing all the time. So if everyone is live streaming constantly, you're basically in a surveillance state, and the main character is on the run for a number of reasons. You got to read the book to find out. But one of the scenes that really stood out to me is as she is running through a park or running to get away from whoever's after her, all someone has to do is look at her. And they're plugged into the Blink network through their use of glasses. And the algorithm will recognize her face and instantly she's found. So scary future. And I can kind of see that happening pretty soon, actually. Life as We Knew It by Susan Beth Pfeffer. This is a young adult story. It describes how society would react if the moon gets struck by an asteroid and is knocked closer to Earth. This one came out a while ago. I didn't read it until this past year. After experiencing the pandemic, I will say that I relived that reading this book, especially when people first reacted to the moon getting hit closer, the panic, seeing the moon so much larger in the sky, how people bought out and stole from grocery stores. It was a very familiar feeling. And I'm very impressed how Susan got it right as far as that mass panic goes. So hard to read right now because it might put you back in that mindset, but I think it's definitely a good story to read. I think stories like these are really important because we as a society might have gotten complacent or comfortable where we are, and it kind of helps us with empathy and understanding when people, like countries or societies where people just don't have that stability. All right, then we have The Warehouse by Rob Hart. This is a wild book. It basically looks at a future where an Amazon-esque company has just taken over the world. And the world building is amazing because if you really want to make a good living, this Amazon-esque company is the only solution. And they've dominated the market. They create dormitories for their laborers. And your job is boiled down to a wristwatch that just buzzes and prompts you every step of your day to the point where you lose total autonomy. Scary stuff, but the story itself has a thrilling element to it. It's a lot of fun. My favorite part is at the beginning where you have this post-apocalyptic setting and everyone is going to a testing site to see if they can qualify for a job, and if so, what type of job. You don't get to choose what type of job. You just, based on the way you answer the questions, you just get assigned your new life. Crazy stuff. A fun read. This next one is dabbing into fantasy. We have A Darker Shade of Magic series by V.E. Schwab, one of my favorite authors. She explores parallel universes with London as the anchor, London being called White London, Grey London, Black London, Red London, depending on that universe's proximity to magic. And the story follows a magical individual who can jump between those parallel universes. So much fun. Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir is a recent book from him and one of my new favorites. He explores deep space travel, and if you have read The Martian or familiar with his work, you know that the thing that makes his work stand out is how realistic it sounds. And I don't know a thing about science, and I think I know enough to be dangerous now that I've read this book. This book isn't just about, however, like a lone astronaut trying to get out of impossible odds. It introduces an amazing character about a third of the way through that just... I don't want to explain more, because the beauty of this book was not knowing what I was getting into. So take it from me, if you just like general speculative sci-fi, just read this book and then tell me how you feel about it in the comments. All right, now we have The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, which depicts a misogynistic society, which is a hard one for me. Story, the book and the show. I grew up in a very traditional household that had a lot of expectations on what I should be doing based off of my gender. And so stories like this, I think, are very good warnings, and but they're triggering. They're triggering to read. And then finally, The Knife of Never Letting Go by Patrick Ness. This one's so interesting to me. It's about humans that have made a new society, made a new society on an alien planet. And what happens when, once they land, all of men's thoughts can be heard, and the resulting discourse that happens out of that. And in the future, it's told from the perspective of a young boy. There are no women left, supposedly, on this planet. And it's just a society of males, and they're dying out, essentially, or they're all aging out. He's like the youngest person there in this town. And then he comes across a girl in the forest. So, interesting stuff. Now that I've given you a limited list of titles, I want to hear your recommendations. Follow Speculative Sandbox on Twitter and Instagram. Leave a comment, and I'll share your recommendations on a future episode. Finally, what do I hope to offer with this podcast? There are so many out there for you to choose from. For one, I am not necessarily trying to compete with anyone. I want to create a safe space for myself and others to get inspired, to overcome that dang writer's block, start conversations, and hopefully build a community. This is just the beginning. My goal is to have a steady supply of episodes, but a lot of that depends on how things naturally progress. Topics you can expect to hear include world building and character discussions, thought exercises, author interviews, and my personal favorite, book tourism. This is where we visit fictional worlds and discuss what it would be like to actually live there. All right, well, thank you for listening to my fellow writers. May your writing sessions be fruitful and your word counts plentiful. Speculative Sandbox is a volunteer-run podcast that relies on the collaboration of fellow creators like yourselves. Join the conversation by following us on Twitter and Instagram. Interested in being in a future episode? Email speculativesandbox@gmail.com.